Good afternoon, everybody. This session will focus mainly on peace building, which, as we talk about, is the challenges and prospects of sustainable peace in the Horn of Africa. And as Prof. Rita mentioned earlier this morning, that peace building and conflict resolution is a cross-cutting theme on all benefit kind of work. And as you are aware that the Horn of Africa is the most complex and unstable region of the world. This instability has created a lot of challenges to each state of the region. And so far, no effort succeeded in bringing about sustainable peace and security to the region. Several researchers has mentioned that this instability could be attributed to external and internal factors. And in fact, some of the effort which has been done so far intensified the conflict and make it or made it to be intractable violent conflicts. I will leave this floor for our two experienced panelists, Mr. Ahmed Suleiman, who is senior research fellow at the Africa program in Chatham House, and Mr. Peter Marsland, who is the chief executive of Concordas International. And I hope that after talking about challenges, there will be some prospects and some kind of roadmap which from conflict elsewhere, which we could benefit from it in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gershab, and thank you to Penha for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here to celebrate the esteemed organization and its anniversary. Yeah, my work, my research focuses on the Horn of Africa region at Chatham House, and I think I'm going to try and touch in the 10 minutes or so that I have on three areas. So one is the evolving political order in the region, in the Horn. More broadly, the second is some of the external influences, as Dr. Gershab mentioned, particularly those emanating from the broader region, from the Gulf and the Middle East. And then maybe, if possible, having a bit of a zoom down and hopefully setting the path for Peter to come in and thinking about the kind of the nature of conflict resolution and peace building within the Horn of Africa region. So I think we're at a very critical juncture when we speak about the broader Horn of Africa region, and we are in a period now of I'd say the beginning of a very substantial political transition in the region. Since 2018, we've had very significant political shifts. I could argue the most significant political shifts in the region since the Cold War, manifest particularly in contestations within the dominant regimes within the Horn of Africa region, in particular Ethiopia, as well as in Sudan, which has been mentioned, of course. Those really predicated on the fall of the previous political settlements and hegemonic orders in Ethiopia, led by the EPRDF, and in Sudan by the National Congress Party. Within each of these two states, domestic policy and governance was closely connected with those regimes' foreign policy, and they sought, both of them, both governments, sometimes in contestation with each other, sometimes in alliance, to shape a regional system in which they influence the political, security, economic, even ideological interests and affairs of neighboring states, be they Djibouti, Eritrea, Somalia and Somali territories, and of course latterly South Sudan too, following its independence. I think this is why the recent wars we have seen, in northern Ethiopia, the Tigray war that started in 2020, and of course the devastating war that we're now experiencing in Sudan since April 2023, have very quickly become regionalized. They're not domestic conflicts. They don't require domestic solutions. They're transnational conflicts at heart. And we see the Horn again as an area, as it has been in the past, of strategic competition and shifting alliances and interests between the neighboring states, and now a much broader set of actors. So for the Horn, I think, as I said at the outset, I think we're at the beginning, or part way through the beginning of a reshaping of the political order in the region, one which is likely to continue at least for the next 5 to 10 years, and which will, of course, define the nature of stability or instability that we see. Ethiopia is a critical part of this. The emergence of Abiy Ahmed and his attempts, I think, to strengthen his position at the center by weakening the regional federal member states is something that is defining his governance, and we don't have a political settlement. We don't have that in Ethiopia at the moment, and what does that mean for essentially nation states within a federal country? Will we see increasing fragmentation based on growing ethnic nationalism, which we're seeing in parts of the country, which we've experienced in Tigray, which we're seeing in the Amhara region, in Oromia, and other parts of the country as well. In Sudan, of course, I think governance is also a part of this, and we have essentially what is being propagated now is a reversal of the Bashir era center-periphery wars. So a strong center which kept the regions and federal states at bay through war, through conflict, and now we have the war being brought to the center by some of the marginal actors, and we see that, of course, through the formation and emboldening of the RSF during the transitional period, but we also see that as a result of partly of the Juba Peace Agreement too, and some of the actors that came to the center through the Juba Peace Agreement that are now, either supporting the warring parties or certainly part of the war in some way, shape, or form. And of course, the region is broader. There are uncertainties around Eritrea, and what we will see. Obviously, we know the nature of governance there hasn't changed, and won't change for some time until the leadership changes. But I'm not going to either speculate about what that leadership change might look like and when it will happen, because I think that's a fool's errand. But of course, there's also a lot of uncertainty in South Sudan too, in Uganda, and also in Djibouti. We have this very fine line between very narrow authoritarian forms of governance and succession, and what that means in the medium term in the region. And then I'd be remiss, if we're talking about the greater IGAD countries, to not mention Kenya's regional role, especially sitting here in capital in London and thinking about Western engagement with Kenya in particular. And I think there are a lot of hopes, or there were a lot of hopes and have been placed in Kenya, certainly under Ruto's administration, that it can emerge as a serious regional anchor, a standard bearer of some form of democratic governance in the region. But I think some of those hopes have been shot down fairly early on, given the government's crackdown on civil society in the wake of protests there. And I think there's an understanding, perhaps, that there's a need not to invest in individual leaders, be they Ruto, be they Abiy, or anyone else, but certainly in institutions, and certainly in civic institutions as well. But Kenya's role over the coming years will be very interesting to see. I think the main thing here, the point that I wanted to make around this area, is that conflict in the region now is very transnational, and we have these cross-regional influences which are increasingly important to shaping the political transitions in the Horn of Africa. Sudan is very much a test case in that regard, given the nature of influences coming from the neighboring countries, and also the pervasiveness of the war economy, and how that is spreading to neighboring countries, and the influence of those from further afield, in particular the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Turkey, as well as Western actors. And this brings me on to the second point, which is around the influence of Middle Eastern countries, in particular the Gulf states in the Horn, and how that's been increasing over several years. I think I make this argument in our research, which is that, and it holds true to some extent, but not fully, and I appreciate that. But the Horn and the Gulf, across the Red Sea anyway, should increasingly be seen as part of a connected sub-region. And in particular, what we see in terms of the transitions in the Horn of Africa is in part mirrored in some of the Gulf states. You know, these are happening in parallel to wider changes in the Gulf MENA state systems, in particular in the UAE and in Saudi Arabia with a very ambitious new or relatively new monarch there. And that is to some extent increasing these regional interdependencies between the Horn and the Gulf region, and to some extent this is very asymmetric. The Horn increasingly is forming part of the Gulf's second tier relationships, you might say, but within that is very important to their post-carbon, their post-fuel oil economic and security horizons. Some of this you see in the UAE's very aggressive foreign policy, very interventionist foreign policy in the Horn of Africa, in Sudan, in Ethiopia, in parts of Somalia, and that's pursued both politically, economically, and through military interests. We also see, of course, food security, critical minerals, other commodities, agriculture, maritime security, and trade in particular as well, being vital to those interests. And in that, the Horn is seen as a bit as a dependent periphery, with assets such as cheap labor, as I mentioned, land, and those minerals, which are important for the Gulf states as they transition away from their current dependency on oil and try to diversify. Part of that is also driven through this contestation, which some colleagues within our Armenia department say is existential between the Saudis and the Emiratis now, and their two governments. And I should mention Egypt too, which of course has substantial economic ties and investments and interests in Sudan, very close military and political ties, as well as intercommunal people-to-people ties, and expanding interests elsewhere in the Horn. Of course, we've seen them using the levers at their disposal in terms of political alliances with Eritrea and the Somali federal government to try and pressure Ethiopia within the region too. So there's a lot happening in terms of the kind of the broader interconnectivity of these two regions. Thirdly, just a quick word on conflict resolution and peace building in the region, and again a kind of nod to the need for these to consider the broader environment in which we're operating and not really be focused within the nation state any longer. They need to be transnational in nature in terms of peace building efforts and high level mediations, and that's due because of these multi-layered interests and the multipolar dynamics which we see more globally speaking, which means that the kind of traditional approach of leverage, in particular from Western actors on regional Gulf states or other actors such as Egypt, simply aren't fit for purpose anymore. I think considering the political settlement, for example, in Sudan, we need to think about not only state interests, but sub-regional, subnational, non-state stakeholders within a kind of wider conflict ecosystem. And that consists of political, economic, military, civic and ideological networks as well. And then more broadly, these high level efforts should be part of a spectrum of peace building processes, and very much within the nature of what we're saying in the region, with very turbulent political transitions and shrinking civic space. I think a focus on subnational local peace building efforts and institutions is essential. Trying to work towards strengthening the agency and resilience of local actors, civic community groups, including incentivizing them not to be co-opted or engage in violence. Of course, intercommunal coordination efforts, whether that be through native or tribal authorities or through intergenerational schemes to kind of bring together different age groups, supporting youth groups, for example, that help to foster social cohesion. I think these are extremely important at this time and during this kind of state level political uncertainty that we have in the Horn. So I'll stop there and pass over to Peter.
Okay. Thank you, Ahmed, for this bold intervention and saying that the conflict in the region is a transitional conflict, and also is the Gulf is connected to the regions, shall we say so? But I will now pass the floor to Peter to see if there are any local solutions, because the time is now, and then we can give them the floor for some comments and questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much. Well, it is a huge, huge pleasure to be here to help celebrate this important 35th anniversary. And what's fascinating, I think, is we've started talking about climate change and building adaptation to the effects of climate change. And one of the things that comes out of the 35 years of research and investment that has gone in through this organisation, through Penha, has been, of course, that transhumance, seasonal cattle movements, that's adaptation, resilient adaptation to the effects of climate change, kind of before that was fashionable. Now we're all talking about resilient adaptation to the effects of climate change, and rightly so. But actually, of course, these mechanisms, these tools, these governance systems that have enabled people and goods and livestock to move enormous distances backwards and forwards across international borders, that is an important part of the current adaptation to the effects of climate change, and it was ever thus. It's a great, I'm representing Concordis International. We are a peace-building organisation, also celebrating our 20th birthday. We're mere youngsters in this context. But Concordis actually set up, and we've been working for 20 years in Sudan and southern Sudan, as was, and now South Sudan. And I just want to start by just my heart going out to Sudanese friends, colleagues here in the room and online, who it's just been our honour and our privilege to walk with you through the highs and lows and lower lows of the last 20 years of Sudanese history. Concordis inception actually was during all the negotiations of what became the CPA, the agreement that ended the Sudanese civil war, and there's lots of conversations between the delegations from the north and south, and they were looking at the sort of 7 barriers that were issues between over the cessation and the treaty, and part of Concordis' role was to come in and say, look, you've got some stuff you're trying to negotiate around where is the border going to go up here or down here, or should we put a dotted line around Abyei because it's a bit difficult, or where this is some of your discussions, and there are some really important debates here. But one of the questions is, how is this newfound international border going to function? And I know there were many of those conversations. And as a Brit, of course, we've not learned any of those net lessons, because we've just set up a nice international border and suddenly realised that customs unions become rather complicated. And actually, people, goods and livestock need to move across those borders, and it actually becomes quite difficult. And that's in the context of a new international border where people, goods and livestock have moved backwards and forwards for generations. Where, and that needs to continue to happen, where these two new countries, if I can call them that, Sudan and South Sudan, a smaller Sudan and South Sudan, they're going to be dependent on one another for global trade, for international trade, and that's got to somehow work. And this border's got to work as a securitized border, and you know, it's not for us Hawajas to put too fine a point on it, but you know, you guys haven't been getting on terribly well for a while, and if the new Sudanese army and the South Sudanese army, let's say the South Sudanese army are chasing cattle rustlers, and they get to this new international border and they cross that border, that's not going to end well. So we're going to need to have some quite difficult conversations about security protocols and how that's all going to work. All of which has got to be within the context of engagement at Khartoum level, engagement at Juba level, recognising that these borderland issues have massive security and jurisdictional issues at the capital city levels, but they've also got enormous significance at the local level, the borderlands level, where frankly the conflict can be experienced most acutely. And so part of those peace processes that came about were looking at how can this border work so that it actually works for the benefit of the people who live in the borderlands, including the transhumant communities, the nomadic communities that we're wanting to move their cattle from summer to winter, wet season to dry season grazing. And part of what came out of that, we've been working in Abyei, which for many colleagues will know, this is contested territory between the two countries, and actually even saying it's contested territory is a contested term. And yet trying to work out, so how can this process work for the benefit of the people in Abyei? Because, not to put too fine a point on it, the Abyei Protocol, which was intended to share oil wealth with the people of Abyei, didn't share so much oil wealth with the people of Abyei. And so a really fascinating part was putting in place the market, which eventually is situated in Amiet, which is right in the middle of the Abyei box. And just as a peace building process and looking at the peace dividends that can be created, those, because the land is contested, those from the south say, well, this is a borderland market. The border is way up here in the north. So if you're going to have a border market, it's got to be up here in Diffra, which the southerners call Kedge. The southerners say, well, look, this is kind of shared space, so we've got a right to move our cattle into this space. Actually, they're perfectly reasonable and right for us to move our cattle and our goods down south to the sort of southern part of the Abyei box, to Abyei town. There's a perfectly good market there. But of course, that really upset the southerners. And so you've just got this really difficult, actually, international conflict between Juba and Khartoum that's not been remotely resolved to this day. And what happened is that people in Abyei decided, through a long, literally 2-year process of negotiation and dialogue, which we were privileged to help facilitate along with other colleagues. And funnily enough, they put the market in the middle. And the northerners didn't like it terribly much, and the southerners didn't like it terribly much. But that's where it was. And from time to time, I'm sorry to say that market burns down. It's made of grass thatch and wood, sort of traditional materials. And in fact, I was there once when it burnt down. The fire caught just about from here to the camera away from me. It was nothing to do with me, and I don't really like putting myself in the centre of the story, but this whole thing, the whole market took up in flames. And it was absolutely tragic, because we are super excited about this market. We're excited about the way this actually is a pragmatic solution to a very difficult international problem, a very local solution. And at the same time, while this was all burning, there are 3,000 shops there. It's a wholesale trade of food, and there were literally hundreds of tons of food literally going up in flames, whilst parts of South Sudan were going into ICP level 5 famine. And we're watching this happen and thinking, God, this is awful. I mean, this is just dreadful. Cut to, I did an appeal. I worked for an international organisation, did an appeal. We shall rebuild. But we were forbidden from having any part in the rebuild. We were actually forbidden by Northerners and Southerners, and I'm not critical of either, but they have their positions, and I get that. And so they refused any international money to rebuild the Amiet market. 5 weeks later, every single one of those 3,000 shops had been rebuilt. Every single one. And funnily enough, though the authorities from the north said, it needs to be a bit further south, and the authorities from the south, it needs to be a bit further north, they put it back where it was. And so, friends, a really interesting piece as we look at pastoralism, as we look at some of these really thorny questions of international politics, which Ahmed has, I know you've only just started scratching the surface of your amazing research that you do. But we've got these incredibly difficult international geopolitics that are at play, and they are real. And a really interesting part is, and a question I think for you, and maybe a question for Penha as we look for the future, is what is the part that could be played to be working on local solutions to some of these very, very difficult challenges? So actually we are working at a regional level, we are working at a geopolitical level, but we're doing it locally. Because to me, when you look at something like the Amiet market, where money is being created, not by some cash for work program, not for some livelihoods generation program, not for some aid or World Food Program or any of those others, not knocking any of those, but it was through trade between herders and farmers, trying to change the incentives such that actually there is a strong incentive for peace, and actually there's quite a strong disincentive for being mean to each other. And so if I could land this in Darfur, and again our hearts go out to all that is going on in Darfur, and for those of us who are thin enough on top to remember the genocides of 20 years ago, we're looking at this with some trepidation. And without making any political comments on any of this, Concordis guards our impartiality very closely and carefully, but we are seeing food and aid being used as a weapon of war in this context. Last year, the last growing season, the crops pretty much failed in South Darfur. And there were a number of reasons for that. The war broke out on the 15th of April. People were very fearful about putting crops in the ground. There was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of displacement, a lot of movement of people. But also, all of the traditional mechanisms for managing kind of herder-farmer relations and for managing sort of how the farmland should be protected, the crops should be protected, broke down in the course of the war. And the crops that were in the ground, most of them were destroyed. And then, of course, there was the conflict on top of that. And much of the harvest last year failed. And this year, through a number of very practical, very pragmatic peace processes that we were able to work with. And this is, I'm speaking to you again as a Hawaja representing the organisation, but these are all our Sudanese colleagues who are working with a network. We have Sudanese and Central African and South Sudanese and Chadian and Cameroonian colleagues who are doing actually all the work, working with a network of 600 community peace builders. And so there in South Darfur, there's this great network of about 220 peace builders, including people from the native administration, from the traditional leadership. And they came to that realization that no one's coming to help them. There's very little aid that's going to be allowed across that Chadian border. And if they are going to live, if they are going to feed their families, those crops need to go into the ground. Those crops need to be protected. Those relations with transhumant groups need to be managed properly. And those crops need to be harvested. And there's a lot of heartbreak in the work we all do. There's a lot of very bad days in the work we do and the lives we choose to lead. But one of the things that has happened, and I want to end lightly, is that the harvest just now is being brought in many parts of South Darfur. And the reason for that is not because those long-standing conflicts and land conflicts and territorial conflicts have all been resolved overnight, but because communities and their often quite junior community leaders have realised that no bugger's coming to feed them. And if they're going to feed their families, they need to get the crops in the ground. They need to manage herder-farmer relationships. And they need to ensure they've got pragmatic solutions that will last for this next season. And then our hope and prayer, of course, is that that will happen next year. And then next year. And then next year. As Ahmed and the geopolitics whirl around us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Peter, for this positive note at the end of the talk. And I just remember that about Abyei, the Messeria and the Denkanukok has been in good relation for ages. I think it is the politics which bring the conflict. And one of the things is the weak governance and corruption, marginalization. All these are the things which drove the conflict. Okay, I will give the floor for 2 to 3 comments because now we don't have time a lot about comments or questions. Ammar?
Hi, my name is Ammar, Sudanese politician. My question is that now we have a new war in Sudan. Actually, it's not new, more than 19. It's just like 19 months now. And the situation itself in the Horn of Africa and in the Red Sea is very difficult to be described, as the conflicts are here and there. So what do you think about the near future on how the conflict in Sudan will affect the region? Thank you.
Can we take another question or comments and then they can respond to it?
As a Somali, as you all know, for the last 30-something years, Somalia has been in and out of war. No, completely unstable, I could say, except that north part, Somaliland. And I am really sorry that when I hear about Sudan, for the last 2 years, it's really very sad. What do you think about, is it very likely that Sudan could end up like Somalia?
You've painted a pretty bleak picture, if you don't mind me saying so, and I guess it's deserved, but are there any positive spots that you see are there any rays of hope somewhere in the region? 'Cause it is very large and very diverse.
Okay, those are all really pertinent, really difficult questions to answer. To start with Amar, I think that, as I was mentioning, the war in Sudan is a regional war. It is not a war only within the confines of Sudan's borders. I think all of the neighboring states, to some degree, are impacted. You see the picture when it comes to the outflow of refugees and the impact that is having within Chad, within Egypt, within South Sudan. We haven't touched on the broader geopolitical interests, but they are there too. I think, as you say, the war economy is evolving as well. So I think this is a part of it. I mean, one of the interesting areas in the research that we're doing at the moment, looking at cross-border conflict, is focused on one commodity, on gold, and how this is both fueling the war, sustaining the war, but actually what impact it is having in the neighboring regions. And why I describe, Sudan's war as being part of a conflict ecosystem is largely because of this. You have these networks of interests. Gold is an assemblage, I think, to this too. So one of the fascinating dynamics is to look at, the networks of connectivity of gold from RSF controlled areas through Chad, through South Sudan and into East Africa. Also to look at from the SAF and I guess Port Sudan authorities areas of control. The majority of the gold we know goes to the United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates it's either in first order directly, including from army controlled areas, or second order, and that means through neighboring countries. So one of the products of this war is that the gold, for example, which is sustaining and fueling the warring parties, is also really important for livelihoods. It's one of the the economic factors keeping people afloat during the war, particularly in artisanal miners, and we know that that's 80 to 90% of people. So it is also within Egypt sustaining increasingly, and Sudanese expertise, artisanal mining expertise, sustaining and supporting Egypt's economy, both through the transfer of gold illicitly and legally, and that being used to buy and purchase commodities, used to exchange as well, so for currency exchange. So I think, and also to open new production areas in southern Egypt. So one of the things that we're seeing is that the war economy is having impacts across the neighboring countries, and we also need to think about how that ties into these global and middle order powers that have an interest within the region and what their interests are. Turning to the I guess the question around whether or not we will seek fragmentation on the level of Somalia, I hope not. Inshallah, that's not going to be the case. But of course, we are already seeing de facto fragmentation in Sudan. We already have lines of control, and the RSF has been pushing to take all of the capitals of the Darfuri states. It of course has large parts of the capital as well, and has pushed successfully into central and tried to move into eastern Sudan. Now we have a pushback by the army and joint Darfuri forces as well to try and regain some of that control, but I don't think either of the sides is able to strategically remove the other. So we have a de facto fragmentation of Sudan at this moment in time, but what could worsen would, if we don't see the urgency required to both push towards a ceasefire and frankly speaking, in my view, not only prioritize the warring parties here, but think about the civilians and the role of civilians and their interests in the future of Sudan, is increasing militarization. A militarization of the civilian population. Now, have we gone from this being a war between warring parties to one where it is a civil war? I think we're getting there now. the population are being militarized, arms are flooding into the country, and we're getting to a situation where it could be, very difficult. We would see a very long time before we can reverse those dynamics. And there's certainly not ones that can be controlled by the two major warring parties themselves, let's say. So much more focus now on the subnational issues and different areas of control, and which armed groups or commanders are controlling these areas, which ultimately leads to these fiefdoms. You have a governance vacuum for a time, and then you have these emerging fiefdoms, with armed control. So unfortunately, that is what we're seeing, and that is why the urgency is there now to find some sort of ceasefire, but the priority is to support Sudanese civilians in charting the future for the country, not to enable the warring parties to do so, and to dictate the terms on which that is agreed. And do we have any positive spots in the Horn of Africa? Yes, there are lots of positive areas in the Horn. I think we shouldn't leave today, and I'm sure it's been mentioned earlier, without talking about the Somaliland elections. That's in it. Those elections, a peaceful transfer of power from one leader to another, despite seemingly a very fractious build-up and an environment, certainly regionally, which might have proved hostile to that election process. We've seen a fairly stable transfer of power there, and the ability also of civilians to continue throughout the region to hold their governments and political elites to account, and to continue to pressure them. I think that is will continue, that will remain, even within restrictive environments, a huge bright spot. And as we were hearing in the presentations earlier, the focus really on resilience and ensuring community cohesion within the region, and the interconnectivity of peoples, which will outlast and goes beyond any era of political leadership or any interests of political elites, despite attempts to divide people along ethnic and other lines. So I think there's a lot of positives to shout about within the region, and ultimately, hopefully, we will return to a time where we're talking about positive integration or engagement between states, less hostility, and thinking about the broader connectivities, infrastructure, people to people, and otherwise between countries that we have done not so long ago.
Thank you for that. I would say there's nothing new under the sun about regional aspects of these conflicts. So actually, if you think back, the impacts of Sudanese politics in South Sudan, in Chad, Chadian politics in Central African Republic, and so the circle goes around. The regional dynamics of all of these conflicts has always been there, I think. But actually, so yeah, there will be those regional impacts. But also you can look at it the other way around. Ahmed has already talked about the economy, the war economies that are going on, looking at gold, but also looking at Central African diamonds and livestock as well. Indeed. And every conflict, every war, in my limited and humble experience, is made up of 1 million choices. Every conflict is made up of the choice that comes when people, under very difficult circumstances, do they have the choice as to whether they fight or do not fight? And if they do have that choice, what choice do they make? When there's a confrontation between, if we really generically say, a herder and a farmer, forgive, in this context I'm desperately avoiding kind of herder-farmer binary dynamics, but let's say there's a conflict between this herder and this farmer, and there's an altercation, whether it's a cattle rustling or a destruction of crops. There's a choice. Do people take up arms, or do they negotiate? Sometimes people feel that they have very little choice, but our work, surely, is to give them better options and better choices. And the really interesting piece is that it's not just those people right at the front line of the conflict who have a choice to make as to whether they send their sons to fight for this group, this armed group, that militia, or actually say, do you know what? I see your fight, but actually I'm sending my son to farm the field or to move the livestock. I'm not going to send my son to fight in the armed group. We're going to negotiate. Now, I know how trite and simplistic I'm being. But actually I know how realistic this can be with very, very careful negotiation. So, the regional dynamic as well is, if these two protagonists choose, we are going to buy in, we're going to use our livestock or our agriculture or our diamonds or our gold to buy in foreign protection, that's a choice that has very, very global impacts, not just in the Middle Eastern region, but further north and east. But if they choose to negotiate, that will also have corresponding impacts on the region. And so my hope, if we're going to end on a hope, my hope is actually that there are opportunities to help people make better choices. And actually, in the absolutely nicest possible way to politicians present, one of the things that can be really, really great is when people hear populist politicians, present company definitely accepted, when people hear populist politicians and say, do you know what, all of your problems, it's their fault, and you'll solve all your problems by killing them. And there are varying narratives of that around populist politicians globally. And frankly, one of the choices we really want people to make is to say, do you know what? No, I'm not going to do that. And disregard those narratives. And that's the bit actually I've got some hope for, because what's really exciting is you see, and it's our privilege to see and spend time with and witness and be with people who have very, very bravely stood up to those who say, what you need to do is to fight. And they've said, not gonna. And that's pretty cool.
Thank you. Well, we are coming now to the close. Is there any burning question?
The Sudanese I knew in the past, Khartoum University, the civil society, the discussions, the newspapers. I don't know what has gone wrong, I enjoyed that freedom. Within the Horn of Africa, I think the Sudanese were the most open, but political. I mean, I met Sudanese in the university, my colleagues, they have a go at the politician, oh, that guy is an idiot, You don't hear that in the other parts of the world. So what I'm trying to say is, what happened to that Sudanese decency of the civil society, of the academia, of the voice even of the religious leaders, whether Christian? What happened to all that? I mean, this is really, because we are somehow avoiding that. And those structures, as far as I know, I hope, from what I know, are very powerful. I mean, in other countries, yes, I can tell you that. The religious leaders are told to keep business, In Sudan, that was my hope. And the civil society in general, we haven't talked about it. What role do we have? Are we cattle? Are we going to die, all of us? I mean, this is a shame on the region, Because that's it. Yeah, done.
Baraka?
I enjoyed the panel. Briefly, it was really easily forecastable to have two armies in the same country, and it was kind of time bomb. One day can really erupt. This happens in Ethiopia between federal army and regional armies, and in Sudan at the same time. So what's your intake, Ahmed, about having two armies in the same country? And it's what could be also happen. So what's your intake, this one? Secondly, there was, especially when Dr. Takasa was there was a promotion of that local solutions for local problems. To have a solution within the region, within the country, within the region, rather than waiting from these Eurocentric approaches for peace building and peacemaking. So, where are IGAD and other regional forces to stop, to prevent first Sudan's conflict, At the same time, when it was erupted, was there any kind of intervention, really tangible intervention, to stop the war? And what do you see? Do you see any future in terms of local solutions for local problems? Thank you.
So, of course, in every civil society, across every nation, you'll have people who will disagree with each other. And you will have people who think that this person is right and this person is an idiot and all those kind of things. And you'll have all of those views. And then, again, telling people stuff they know. But of course, then when people face grievance and they face hardship and they face conflict, it's quite a natural human reaction to take quite an antagonistic and polarized effect. And for those as a Brit, I'll just raise you Brexit. I mean, for goodness sake, even that could just divide families. Scottish devolution can divide families, and these are really very trite issues compared to armed conflict. And so, yes, of course, there are these wonderfully educated voices and well-formed civil society, but of course they come under huge threat. And so I am a big advocate for local solutions to local problems, of course. And sometimes I know that when I have a problem myself, sometimes it's quite helpful to have a mediator just to help me manage that conflict through. And I think if I can say that, and I say that with real humility in this context, for all of us to work out how do we get the best out of everything we can give. So of course we get local solutions, but of course we also are willing to just ask for help when we need it, and to make sure that that's done where power rests in the right places, where it's not done in an authoritarian way, where it's not done in a draconian way. But actually, of course, many people are very hurt, very wounded, very upset, and that can be a really tough place for people to be with. And so, of course, people can become angry. And I should say, when I just do my last piece for choices that we all make, there are choices for diaspora to make too. There are choices for diaspora to make about the things that they trumpet and the things that they shout down, the things that they praise, the things that they re-X or they repost on social media. And so for all of us looking to use the power, the influence and the resources that we have to make good choices and choices for peace. That surely is a big mandate for all of us.
Thank you. 1 minute. Okay. So quickly on the question of armies, I think that's an excellent point. I think it's really difficult. I believe the two contexts between Ethiopia and Sudan are very different. I think some of the state security organs within Sudan were set up really to compete with each other, and we see that really in how the RSF has evolved. And how it's become a competitor to the army, but it was of course part of the partnership within the transitional period within the Sovereignty Council, and complicit to overthrowing the civilian cabinet at the time. So I think this is partly as a result of President Bashir not wanting to empower and embolden one armed institution more than another, and to ensure that there were checks and balances. Whereas in Ethiopia's case, I think there are merits to having regional and federal forces, but of course I think the management and the hierarchy and the structures and the command and control of those forces is something that needs to be reimagined in future to be more cohesive, and to obviously prevent regional forces going to war with federal forces. Yes. Okay, so we'll finish on that. I think we're just on the point of where is IGAD and the African Union in the Sudan war. Unfortunately, we haven't seen enough from either of them, either individually or together. But they are vital as part of a broader constellation that that needs to really come together and unify both, I guess, the tracks around ceasefire, around humanitarian intervention, and around what the political process should be moving forward. I mean, they need to be a critical part of that, the African Union and IGAD, but I think we've seen a lot of jostling and fracturing of that process, and it needs to be unified for the benefit of Sudan and come to some form of solution as a first step reaching a ceasefire.